Hey there. Settle in by the fire with me. Let the room stay dim. Let the candlelight rest on the quiet edges of everything. Where did 295,000 years go? The years before cities and writing began. That is the strange missing weight in our story. Because modern humans like you and me have been here for more than 300,000 years. Yet the history we usually recite fits into the last 5,000. A thin strip, a bright ribbon laid on top of a very dark ocean. If you learned history in school, you probably met Egypt and its pyramids, Mesopotamia and its kings, Rome and its roads, maybe Greece and its thinkers. All of it feels ancient, and it is, but it is also incredibly recent. 5,000 years is less than 2% of our time on Earth. The rest is a long hallway with most of the doors sealed, not because nothing happened, but because the air itself has erased the footprints. Tonight I want to walk with you down that hallway. Not fast, slow enough that you can feel the dust of deep time, the dry grit of old stone, the cool hush of a museum room where a single tool sits under glass. We will look at what is missing, and at the few pages we still have. Bones, flakes of rock, red clay dust on fingertips, shadows of hands on cave walls. And we will keep returning to the same calm truth. Those people were not monsters, not brutes, not half-awake animals. They were us, living before our modern habits existed. If you like drifting off to stories like this, tap like and subscribe. It is a small motion. Then you can let your body soften. Now take a slow breath in and let it go. Let your jaw loosen. Let your shoulders drop. Listen to the fire. Listen to how the crackle comes, then pauses, then comes again, as if the flames are speaking in a language made of rest. Here is the first unsettling detail. A person living 200,000 years ago had a brain the same size as yours. The same capacity for language, emotion, problem-solving, creativity. If you could lift them out of their time and place them gently into ours, if you dressed them in modern clothes, they could walk down a street without attracting a second glance. They were anatomically modern. The difference was not the hardware. The difference was the world around them. The software of culture that had not yet been built, the long accumulation of tools, stories, and systems that we inherit without noticing. Here is the second unsettling detail. For most of that long span, there were no cities, no farms, no writing, no kings with names stamped into clay. So there are no letters from that time, no laws, no archives. And even if a brilliant idea existed, it was held in breath and memory, then lost when a voice fell silent. Here is the third detail, the one that keeps researchers awake. We have probably found only a tiny fraction of what existed. Wood rots. Leather disappears. Fiber turns to dust. Coastal camps were swallowed by rising seas when the last ice age ended. 1,000 shoreline villages could vanish without leaving more than a few stones. Time does not preserve most of what people touch. So when we ask, where did those years go? The honest answer is, we do not really know. Not in the way we know Julius Caesar or Cleopatra. We know in fragments. A tool edge, a healed bone, a stain of pigment, A campfire circle made of darker soil. A carved line on a piece of ochre. It is like finding a few pages from a book that was thousands of volumes long. Pages torn, wet, and half burned. And still, even those pages can change everything. I want you to picture a shoreline. Not a modern shoreline with fences and signs. A shoreline from a world without maps. Wet sand, the tide pulling away, leaving ripples like small ribs. A single human footprint presses into the mud, then fills slowly with water. Behind that footprint, Africa. Ahead, the rest of the world. The footprint will be gone by morning, but the act of stepping was real. This is the kind of evidence we are dealing with. Acts that were immense, and traces that are delicate. Now picture the opposite. A place where time protects rather than erases. A cave. Deep enough that the air stays still. Cool stone that beads with moisture. Darkness that swallows sound. In those places, sometimes, the world keeps a secret for tens of thousands of years. Sometimes it keeps a hand. Sometimes it keeps a line of charcoal. Sometimes it keeps a footprint of soot on a ceiling. And when we find it, we feel a shock, not because it is alien, but because it is intimate. Honestly, I have always found it strange that we call this era prehistory, as if it is a blank. It was not blank to the people living it. They had births, grief, jokes, jealousy, tenderness, long walks, short storms, hungry nights, bright mornings. They stared at the same stars. They wondered about the same questions, even if their answers were sung instead of written. They were raising children. They were falling in love. They were making art. They were surviving in environments that would kill most of us if we arrived there unprepared. So let us begin at the beginning we can touch. The moment when fossils appear that look like us. We have skulls from Africa that show the modern shape. A high, rounded cranium. A smaller, flatter face. The chin that marks our species. A site in Morocco called Jebel Irhoud pushed our timeline back in a way that surprised many experts. The remains were dated to around 315,000 years ago. That discovery shattered an older story that modern humans appeared suddenly in one place, then spread. Instead, it suggests multiple populations across Africa, connected by migration and mixing, slowly converging toward the same body plan. But here comes the maddening part. A modern body does not automatically mean a modern mind. The brains were large. Yes, the structure was there. Still, the archaeological record from those early periods feels sparse. Stone tools, yes. Hunting and gathering, yes. But little that screams symbolic thought. Little that leaves a clear trace of the inner life we recognize as fully modern. For a long time, the tools look similar to those made by other human species. This is why there is a debate that does not end. Did modern anatomy come first, with modern behavior arriving much later? Or did the capacity for complex thought always exist, only rarely preserved? Some scholars argue for a late flowering, a cognitive shift. Others argue the capacity was always there, waiting, and we only see it when preservation and population size allow. Tonight, we will hold that uncertainty gently. We will not pretend we can see inside skulls. We will follow the trail where it becomes visible, where meaning begins to stick to objects. A smear of red clay that cannot be eaten. A bead drilled with care. A body placed in the earth not as waste but as a marked crossing. Let us sit with the number for a moment. 295,000 years. If you counted 1 year per breath, slow and calm, you would still be breathing long after the fire in this room became ash, long after every city you know turned to dust. That is what deep time does. It makes the familiar feel like a spark. Now picture a textbook line. The first cities, the first writing, the first kings. It looks clean, but it is only a thin crust. Under it lies layer after layer of human nights. Nights with no street lamps, no glass windows, no calendars on walls. Only a band of people close together, listening to wind, listening to animals, listening to each other breathe. When I say band, do not picture a crowd. Picture 20 people, maybe 30, faces you know from childhood, hands you recognize by the way they tie a cord or lift a bowl. A baby passed from arm to arm, an elder rubbing warmth into stiff fingers. A small fire, not large, just enough to keep the night from biting too hard. The flames paint the same orange light on cheeks that you see on your own hands right now. And outside that small light, a world that does not care. Rain that can soak a hide and turn it heavy. Cold that can stiffen joints. Predators that watch from the edge of sight. Drought that shrinks rivers. Storms that erase tracks. Those early people lived with a kind of attention we rarely need. They had to notice everything. The tilt of a bird's flight. The smell of the air before weather changes. The taste of water that warns of sickness. The way a herd moves when danger is near. This is why it feels wrong to call them primitive. They were specialists in reality. Their knowledge was not written. It was carried in muscle and memory. A child learned by watching, then doing, then being corrected, again and again, until skill became instinct. A child learned which plant feeds and which plant poisons, which stone makes a sharp edge, which path stays safe when the river rises, which season brings the first berries, which hollow holds water after a dry month. Mistakes could kill, so learning was precise. There is another reason the missing years feel empty in our modern mind. We tend to remember what leaves monuments. Stone walls, towers, temples. But most of human life was made of things that vanish. Wooden shelters, woven baskets, sinew cord, clothing sewn from hide, songs that existed only in throats, stories that lived only in ears. Imagine a camp on a coast 10,000 years ago, before the sea rose to its modern level. Families fishing in shallow water, shells piled near a fire, children chasing birds on wet sand, a simple shelter of poles and hides. Then, over generations, the water climbs, not in one dramatic wave, but slowly, relentlessly. The shoreline moves. The camp is abandoned. The sea takes the poles. The hide dissolves. The shells scatter. What remains is silence under salt. This is why researchers say we have only a fraction. The past is not missing because people were absent. The past is missing because preservation is cruelly selective. Sometimes we find a bone, a fragment of skull, a tooth, a jaw with that modern chin. Those hard pieces survive where skin and hair and laughter do not. Sometimes we find stone flakes, a sharp edge that still cuts a finger if you touch it carelessly. And sometimes we find art, a painted animal in a cave, a hand stencil, a carved line that has no obvious practical use. These are the moments when the past stops being abstract and becomes personal. If you were standing in a cave with a torch, you would feel the air change. Outside, wind. Inside, stillness. Outside, the smell of grass. Inside, the smell of stone and damp. Your footsteps would sound louder, then softer, then louder again depending on the shape of the passage. The torch would hiss. Fat or resin would drip. A small flame would paint the wall, and shadows would move as if the rock itself was alive. Now imagine that. But imagine the torch is not yours. It is held by someone 30,000 years ago. Their hand is the same shape as yours. Their fingers curl around the torch the same way. They lift pigment to stone. They press a palm to the wall and blow color around it. Then they step back and see a negative hand, a ghost of presence. They do not know you will ever exist. Still, they leave a mark that reaches you. This is the connection that makes the missing years feel less empty. The people in deep time were not strangers. They were family, multiplied and repeated across generations until the chain reaches you. Now let us return to the question at the start. Where did those years go? They did not go anywhere. They happened. They were lived. They were lost. And now we are trying to reconstruct them from the few things that endured. In the next part, we will place our hands into those enduring traces. We will follow the red dust of ochre. We will follow the small drilled hole in a shell bead. We will follow the quiet decision to bury a dead body with care. These are small acts, but they are the first moments when inner life becomes visible in the ground. One more gentle thought before we move on. When you hear the phrase missing years, try to replace it with hidden years. Hidden under water. Hidden under sand. Hidden under forest soil. Hidden inside caves. Hidden inside the bodies of living people as inherited instincts. The way your attention sharpens in darkness. The way a story calms you when the world feels too large. Stay with the warmth. Let the Hey there. Settle in by the fire with me. Let the room stay dim. Let the candlelight rest on the quiet edges of everything. Where did 295,000 years go? The years before cities and writing began. That is the strange missing weight in our story. Because modern humans like you and me have been here for more than 300,000 years. Yet the history we usually recite fits into the last 5,000. A thin strip, a bright ribbon laid on top of a very dark ocean. If you learned history in school, you probably met Egypt and its pyramids, Mesopotamia and its kings, Rome and its roads, maybe Greece and its thinkers. All of it feels ancient, And it is. But it is also incredibly recent. 5,000 years is less than 2% of our time on Earth. The rest is a long hallway with most of the doors sealed. Not because nothing happened, but because the air itself has erased the footprints. Tonight I want to walk with you down that hallway. Not fast, slow enough that you can feel the dust of deep time, the dry grit of old stone, the cool hush of a museum room where a single tool sits under glass. We will look at what is missing, and at the few pages we still have. Bones, flakes of rock, red clay dust on fingertips, shadows of hands on cave walls. And we will keep returning to the same calm truth. Those people were not monsters, not brutes, not half-awake animals. They were us, living before our modern habits existed. If you like drifting off to stories like this, tap like and subscribe. It is a small motion. Then you can let your body soften. Now take a slow breath in and let it go. Let your jaw loosen. Let your shoulders drop. Listen to the fire. Listen to how the crackle comes, then pauses, then comes again, as if the flames are speaking in a language made of rest. Here is the first unsettling detail. A person living 200,000 years ago had a brain the same size as yours, the same capacity for language, emotion, problem-solving, creativity. If you could lift them out of their time and place them gently into ours, if you dressed them in modern clothes, they could walk down a street without attracting a second glance. They were anatomically modern. The difference was not the hardware. The difference was the world around them, the software of culture that had not yet been built, the long accumulation of tools, stories, and systems that we inherit without noticing. Here is the second unsettling detail. For most of that long span, there were no cities, no farms, no writing, no kings with names stamped into clay. So there are no letters from that time, no laws, no archives. And even if a brilliant idea existed, it was held in breath and memory, then lost when a voice fell silent. Here is the third detail, the one that keeps researchers awake. We have probably found only a tiny fraction of what existed. Wood rots. Leather disappears. Fiber turns to dust. Coastal camps were swallowed by rising seas when the last ice age ended. 1,000 shoreline villages could vanish without leaving more than a few stones. Time does not preserve most of what people touch. So when we ask, where did those years go? The honest answer is, we do not really know. Not in the way we know Julius Caesar or Cleopatra. We know in fragments. A tool edge, a healed bone, a stain of pigment, a campfire circle made of darker soil, a carved line on a piece of ochre. It is like finding a few pages from a book that was thousands of volumes long. Pages torn, wet, and half burned. And still, even those pages can change everything. I want you to picture a shoreline, not a modern shoreline with fences and signs, a shoreline from a world without maps. Wet sand, the tide pulling away, leaving ripples like small ribs. A single human footprint presses into the mud, then fills slowly with water. Behind that footprint, Africa. Ahead, the rest of the world, The footprint will be gone by morning, but the act of stepping was real. This is the kind of evidence we are dealing with. Acts that were immense, and traces that are delicate. Now picture the opposite. A place where time protects rather than erases. A cave, deep enough that the air stays still. Cool stone that beads with moisture. Darkness that swallows sound. In those places, sometimes, the world keeps a secret for tens of thousands of years. Sometimes it keeps a hand. Sometimes it keeps a line of charcoal. Sometimes it keeps a footprint of soot on a ceiling. And when we find it, we feel a shock, not because it is alien, but because it is intimate. Honestly, I have always found it strange that we call this era prehistory, as if it is a blank. It was not blank to the people living it. They had births, grief, jokes, jealousy, tenderness, long walks, short storms, hungry nights, bright mornings. They stared at the same stars. They wondered about the same questions, even if their answers were sung instead of written. They were raising children. They were falling in love. They were making art. They were surviving in environments that would kill most of us if we arrived there unprepared. So let us begin at the beginning we can touch. The moment when fossils appear that look like us. We have skulls from Africa that show the modern shape. A high, rounded cranium. A smaller, flatter face. The chin that marks our species. A site in Morocco called Jebel Irhoud pushed our timeline back in a way that surprised many experts. The remains were dated to around 315,000 years ago. That discovery shattered an older story that modern humans appeared suddenly in one place, then spread. Instead, it suggests multiple populations across Africa, connected by migration and mixing, slowly converging toward the same body plan. But here comes the maddening part. A modern body does not automatically mean a modern mind. The brains were large. Yes, the structure was there. Still, the archaeological record from those early periods feels sparse. Stone tools, yes. Hunting and gathering, yes. But little that screams symbolic thought. Little that leaves a clear trace of the inner life we recognize as fully modern. For a long time, the tools look similar to those made by other human species. This is why there is a debate that does not end. Did modern anatomy come first, with modern behavior arriving much later? Or did the capacity for complex thought always exist, only rarely preserved? Some scholars argue for a late flowering, a cognitive shift. Others argue the capacity was always there, waiting, and we only see it when preservation and population size allow. Tonight, we will hold that uncertainty gently. We will not pretend we can see inside skulls. We will follow the trail where it becomes visible, where meaning begins to stick to objects. A smear of red clay that cannot be eaten. A bead drilled with care. A body placed in the earth not as waste but as a marked crossing. Let us sit with the number for a moment. 295,000 years. If you counted 1 year per breath, slow and calm, you would still be breathing long after the fire in this room became ash, long after every city you know turned to dust. That is what deep time does. It makes the familiar feel like a spark. Now picture a textbook line. The first cities, the first writing, the first kings. It looks clean, but it is only a thin crust. Under it lies layer after layer of human nights. Nights with no street lamps, no glass windows, no calendars on walls. Only a band of people close together, listening to wind, listening to animals, listening to each other breathe. When I say band, do not picture a crowd. Picture 20 people, maybe 30, faces you know from childhood, hands you recognize by the way they tie a cord or lift a bowl. A baby passed from arm to arm, an elder rubbing warmth into stiff fingers. A small fire, not large, just enough to keep the night from biting too hard. The flames paint the same orange light on cheeks that you see on your own hands right now. And outside that small light, a world that does not care. Rain that can soak a hide and turn it heavy. Cold that can stiffen joints. Predators that watch from the edge of sight. Drought that shrinks rivers. Storms that erase tracks. Those early people lived with a kind of attention we rarely need. They had to notice everything. The tilt of a bird's flight. The smell of the air before weather changes. The taste of water that warns of sickness. The way a herd moves when danger is near. This is why it feels wrong to call them primitive. They were specialists in reality. Their knowledge was not written. It was carried in muscle and memory. A child learned by watching, then doing, then being corrected, again and again, until skill became instinct. A child learned which plant feeds and which plant poisons, which stone makes a sharp edge, which path stays safe when the river rises, which season brings the first berries, which hollow holds water after a dry month. Mistakes could kill, so learning was precise. There is another reason the missing years feel empty in our modern mind. We tend to remember what leaves monuments. Stone walls, towers, temples. But most of human life was made of things that vanish. Wooden shelters, woven baskets, sinew cord, clothing sewn from hide, songs that existed only in throats, stories that lived only in ears. Imagine a camp on a coast 10,000 years ago, before the sea rose to its modern level. Families fishing in shallow water, shells piled near a fire, children chasing birds on wet sand, a simple shelter of poles and hides. Then, over generations, the water climbs, not in one dramatic wave, but slowly, relentlessly. The shoreline moves. The camp is abandoned. The sea takes the poles. The hide dissolves. The shells scatter. What remains is silence under salt. This is why researchers say we have only a fraction. The past is not missing because people were absent. The past is missing because preservation is cruelly selective. Sometimes we find a bone, a fragment of skull, a tooth, a jaw with that modern chin. Those hard pieces survive, where skin and hair and laughter do not. Sometimes we find stone flakes, a sharp edge that still cuts a finger if you touch it carelessly. And sometimes we find art, a painted animal in a cave, a hand stencil, a carved line that has no obvious practical use, These are the moments when the past stops being abstract and becomes personal. If you were standing in a cave with a torch, you would feel the air change. Outside, wind. Inside, stillness. Outside, the smell of grass. Inside, the smell of stone and damp. Your footsteps would sound louder, then softer, then louder again depending on the shape of the passage. The torch would hiss. Fat or resin would drip. A small flame would paint the wall, and shadows would move as if the rock itself was alive. Now imagine that. But imagine the torch is not yours. It is held by someone 30,000 years ago. Their hand is the same shape as yours. Their fingers curl around the torch the same way. They lift pigment to stone. They press a palm to the wall and blow color around it. Then they step back and see a negative hand, a ghost of presence. They do not know you will ever exist. Still, they leave a mark that reaches you. This is the connection that makes the missing years feel less empty. The people in deep time were not strangers. They were family, multiplied and repeated across generations until the chain reaches you. Now let us return to the question at the start. Where did those years go? They did not go anywhere. They happened. They were lived. They were lost. And now we are trying to reconstruct them from the few things that endured. In the next part, we will place our hands into those enduring traces. We will follow the red dust of ochre. We will follow the small drilled hole in a shell bead. We will follow the quiet decision to bury a dead body with care. These are small acts, but they are the first moments when inner life becomes visible in the ground. One more gentle thought before we move on. When you hear the phrase missing years, try to replace it with hidden years. Hidden under water. Hidden under sand. Hidden under forest soil. Hidden inside caves. Hidden inside the bodies of living people as inherited instincts. The way your attention sharpens in darkness. The way a story calms you when the world feels too large. Stay with the warmth. Let the candlelight feel like a small bridge across the gap. We will cross it together, from bones and tools into color and symbol, from silence into the first marks of meaning. The night feels wider when you think in deep time, but we can keep it gentle, one small artifact at a time, one small breath, one small motion of a hand. Let us start with color. Not paint on a canvas, not ink on a page, but red earth ground into powder. At a place in South Africa called Pinnacle Point, archaeologists found evidence of systematic ochre processing. Ochre is clay colored by iron. It can be yellow or deep red, and humans have been drawn to it for a very long time. You cannot eat it. It does not make a sharper spear. It is messy. It stains skin. It clings under fingernails. So why would people grind it, carry it, store it, use it? The most likely answer is meaning, decoration, ritual, marking bodies or objects as special. In a world without writing, color can become a language. Picture the act. A person crouches by a flat stone. In one hand, a chunk of ochre. In the other, a grinding stone. They press and move in slow circles. The sound is soft, stone on stone, a steady rasp. Red dust gathers like fine spice. It coats the fingertips. It catches in the creases of the palm. A breath passes over it and lifts a faint cloud that settles again. The person looks at the red and feels something. We cannot name it, but we can recognize the impulse to take the world and make it signify. Then come beads. Around 100,000 years ago, shell beads appear, carefully perforated for stringing. A shell is small. A hole drilled through it takes time and skill. A cord must be made. The bead must be worn where others can see. This is not survival in the narrow sense. This is identity. When you wear a bead, you are saying, I belong. I am part of this group. I have a place in the web. I am not alone. Imagine a shoreline camp at dusk. Sea wind, salt in the air, a small fire. Someone sits near the light and threads beads. One, then another. The cord tightens. A knot is tied. The necklace is lifted and held in the firelight. The shells glow pale. The person smiles. Not loudly, just a soft shift in the face. Then the necklace is placed on a neck, and suddenly the body carries a sign. A symbol that can travel beyond the camp and still speak. Now comes the moment that changes everything. Burial. The first clear evidence of intentional burial by Homo sapiens appears around 100,000 years ago. Not a body abandoned. Not a body covered by accident. A deliberate grave. A hole dug with simple tools. A task that takes hours. Hands sore. Shoulders tired. Breath steady in cold air. The group stops what it is doing. The world pauses. Because one person has crossed a line. Think about what that means. A living group chooses to spend precious time and energy on someone who will never again gather food, never again help carry water, never again laugh or warn or sing. They position the body carefully. They place objects nearby. They cover the grave. They remember where it is. This requires abstract thought, emotional complexity, and a sense that the dead matter beyond their utility. We cannot hear their words. We do not know their prayers. Still, the shape of the act is familiar. A hand smoothing earth. A pause before the first soil falls. A group standing close, not speaking much, because speech feels too sharp. A child held back gently, not to hide death, but to make the moment calmer. A look exchanged between two adults that contains grief and endurance at the same time. Some scholars argue that burial marks the first visible stirrings of philosophy and religion. It is consciousness meeting mortality. It is a mind that can imagine absence and still choose to honor. It is a question placed into the ground. What happens now? Where did they go? Will we meet again? Why are we here? We cannot be sure when a human first looked at the stars and asked why, but burial suggests the big questions were already present. And then, as if the story was not complicated enough, we must remember that our ancestors were not alone. Between 300,000 and 40,000 years ago, Earth was home to multiple human species. Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans across huge parts of Asia, known from few bones but visible in DNA. Other lineages with names that sound like echoes: Homo naledi, Homo floresiensis, Homo lutsonensis. A crowded human planet, a messy tree, not a straight line, more like braided rivers that split and rejoin. Our species met these others. Sometimes we competed. Sometimes we avoided. Sometimes we fought, though we cannot always see it. Sometimes we mated. Modern populations in Europe and Asia carry roughly 2% Neanderthal DNA. Some populations in the Pacific carry more Denisovan ancestry. That means encounters happened, not once, but many times, over vast distances. Pieces of those vanished humans still live inside living bodies. This leads to a question that feels quiet and sharp. Why did Homo sapiens survive when the others faded? It was not simple intelligence. Neanderthals had large brains. It was not simply tool skill. Others made sophisticated tools too. Some researchers think the advantage was social networks, larger, more flexible, able to share resources and ideas across distance. Others point to language, not just sounds, but syntax. The ability to build endless meaning, to coordinate, to tell stories of past and future with precision. And there is another possibility that sounds humble and almost frightening. Luck, climate swings, bottlenecks, a few storms at the wrong time, a drought, a volcano winter, a disease. The fossil record is full of species that dominated until they did not. What we can say is that by around 70,000 years ago, the archaeological record shifts. Suddenly, we see an explosion of complex behavior, elaborate tools, long-distance trade, musical instruments, sophisticated art, complex burials. Some call it a cognitive revolution, though the name can mislead. The hardware was already there. Maybe the software unlocked. Maybe population reached a threshold so innovations could spread and accumulate. Maybe preservation finally caught up with behavior. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. We have to hold that gently. Let us slow down further and let the burial scene remain gentle. A body is heavy. Even a small body becomes heavy when it is still. So the group works together. One person lifts the shoulders. Another supports the legs. Someone else clears stones from the edge of the grave so the body can rest without pressure. The earth is cold. The tools are simple. Hands become dirty. Breath becomes visible in cool air. Time stretches, because grief stretches it. When the body is placed, there is often a pause. Not dramatic. Just the human pause that happens when words fail. A hand touches a forehead once. A strand of hair is moved aside. An object is placed nearby. A tool. A bead. A piece of ochre. Food. We cannot always tell which items were placed for practical reasons and which were symbolic. Still, the pattern repeats across regions and across long spans. It suggests intention. Red ochre appears again and again in graves across Africa, Europe, and Asia, sprinkled over bodies, rubbed into skin, packed around bones. It is debated what it meant. Some think it symbolized blood and life. Some think it symbolized rebirth, the red of sunrise, the promise that death is a transformation. We cannot be sure, but we can be sure it mattered, because gathering and grinding large quantities took effort. Effort is a kind of proof. Now, step back and look at the world they lived in. A world that held not one human species but several. It is easy to picture ourselves alone, because we are alone now. But in deep time, our ancestors could have met others who walked upright, spoke in voices, made tools, tended fires. Neanderthals had Europe and Western Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. They endured Ice Age cold. They hunted large animals. They made complex toolkits. There is evidence they buried their dead too. Some evidence suggests they used pigments and perhaps made marks on cave walls. They were not mindless. They were a different human branch. Denisovans are stranger to us because their bones are rare. A tooth, a fragment of finger bone, a few pieces in a Siberian cave. Still, DNA tells us they ranged widely. Pieces of Denisovan ancestry appear in modern people, from Tibet to New Guinea. Some Tibetan populations carry Denisovan-derived variants that help with oxygen at high altitude. That means deep time meetings happened on mountain slopes and in forests. And those meetings still echo inside living lungs. Other lineages appear like brief shadows. Homo naledi in South Africa, with a mix of features that confuse simple categories. Homo floresiensis on an island in Indonesia, small in body, still making stone tools. Homo luzonensis in the Philippines, known from few fossils, still another branch. There may have been more. Some genetic patterns suggest contributions from human groups we have not yet found in bone. Ghost populations. Names we do not have. This is why the old-school story of a neat ladder is wrong. It was a thicket. A landscape full of human-like beings. Some meeting. Some avoiding. Some merging. Some fading. Our species is the one that remained. But remaining is not the same as being morally better. So why did we remain? Some researchers point to social networks. Imagine two kinds of groups. One kind lives in small, isolated bands with limited exchange. The other kind builds wider networks. Trading stone, shell, pigment, and information across long distances. If drought hits one valley, the networked group can lean on distant partners. If a new tool technique appears, it spreads. If a song carries a warning about a predator or a poisonous plant, it travels. Networks create resilience. Others point to language. Not just calls and gestures, but complex syntax. The ability to combine words into endless meanings. With that, you can plan hunts days ahead. You can teach a child without showing, using description. You can tell stories that hold group identity. You can share a mistake and prevent it from being repeated. Even a small advantage compounds over thousands of years. And yet, it is possible that chance mattered too. Climate swings were brutal. A cold snap could empty a region. A drought could force migration. A disease could sweep through a small band. If one group happened to be in the right place, near water, near coast resources, near a refuge zone, it could survive while others vanished. Luck is not romantic, but it is real. By around 70,000 years ago, something becomes visible in the record. More elaborate tools, long-distance trade, beads, art, music, burials with more consistent ritual signs. Some call it a revolution. It may have been a threshold in population density that allowed ideas to accumulate rather than being lost. It may have been a shift in climate that created new corridors and new pressures. It may have been that we finally have enough surviving evidence to notice what had already been happening. We cannot be sure, but we can feel the change in the fragments. If you want a simple image for that change, picture a night camp, a fire, a circle of faces. One person holds a bone flute and blows a note. The sound is thin and haunting. It floats into cold air. A child listens and feels something new. Not only hunger and safety, but beauty. Another person takes a shell bead and threads it onto a cord. Another person rubs red ochre into a line on skin. These are small gestures, but they are the gestures that build culture. Now let the fire in this room steady you. Deep time can feel heavy, but it can also feel comforting because it tells you that your mind is old. Your need for story is old. Your need for connection is old. In the next part, we will step into daily life. We will undo the caveman myth slowly, and we will walk through a morning in a band, a morning with shared warmth, skilled work, and long quiet hours that were not empty, but full of living. As you settle, imagine your own hand for a moment. The lines in your palm, the warmth in your fingertips. Those lines have been carried through thousands of generations. Hands that ground ochre, hands that knotted cords, hands that covered graves, hands that lifted children, hands that held fire. The missing time is not empty. It is holding you, even now, as you drift. When people say caveman, they usually mean a creature who is barely a person. Some heavy-browed brute crouched in a dark hole, grunting, starving, dirty, confused, and only half awake to the world. I have always found that image strangely insulting, not only to them, but to us. Because the humans living 50,000 years ago were not failed drafts of humanity. They were humanity. Their minds were not dimmer. Their emotions were not smaller. Their lives were not empty waiting rooms before civilization finally arrived and taught them how to think. If you took a newborn from that time and somehow placed that child in a modern home, fed and loved and educated them, the child would grow into someone you would recognize instantly. They could learn language. They could read. They could solve equations. They could laugh at jokes, worry about the future, and feel lonely in a crowded room. The hardware was already there. What changed over time was not the human brain itself, but the cultural world wrapped around it. So let us take a slow walk through a day. Not a fantasy day built from old cartoons, but a day assembled from archaeology, from the bodies ancient people left behind, and from careful comparisons with hunter-gatherer societies that survived into more recent times. A day that is quiet, practical, skilled, and much less miserable than modern people often imagine. Morning begins not with an alarm, but with light. The sky pales. Cold air shifts. Someone near the embers moves first. A hand reaches into ash and stirs for heat. A coal brightens, then another. A small flame rises when dry tinder is added. Around it, bodies still half asleep adjust under hides and woven coverings. A child turns and presses closer to a parent. Someone coughs once. Someone murmurs something too soft to catch. The camp is waking in layers, not all at once. Their sleep was not quite like ours. Not one sealed block of 8 hours behind a locked door. People often woke in the night, checked the fire, checked the children, listened to sounds outside, spoke quietly, then drifted back down again. That pattern, broken and natural, may have been common for much of human existence. It feels strange only because we have trained ourselves into something narrower. Breakfast is modest. Not a table loaded with choices, but not desperate either. A little dried meat from a previous hunt. Some nuts. Maybe berries if the season allows. Maybe roasted roots. Enough to satisfy hunger. Enough to let the body begin its work. And here comes the part many modern people resist. The work does not fill every waking hour. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherers in more recent centuries found again and again that daily subsistence work could often be done in just a few hours. 3, sometimes 4, sometimes 5, depending on season and luck and landscape. The rest of the day was not wasted. It was used for repairing tools, teaching children, talking, resting, making ornaments, telling stories, watching the sky, bathing in rivers, flirting, arguing, laughing, listening. In one sense, these people were poor in possessions. In another sense, they were rich in time. That does not mean life was easy. It means the old picture of endless grinding desperation is wrong. A good gatherer did not stumble blindly through a field hoping to get lucky. A good gatherer could read a landscape with the same precision a skilled reader brings to a page. This patch of ordinary grass hides edible roots deep below. That cluster of trees will give inner bark in late winter. Those seeds are not ready yet. Those berries are sweet now, but bitter in another week. That plant heals a fever if prepared correctly, and kills if confused with its look-alike. This is not primitive guesswork. This is field science, practiced through memory, apprenticeship, and consequence. Imagine a woman kneeling near low plants after early rain. Her fingers move through leaves with certainty. She does not pull at everything. She selects. She checks the stem, the smell, the place where it grows. She twists gently, lifts the root, shakes off dark soil, and sets it into a basket. Beside her, a child watches. The child reaches for another plant. A quiet correction follows. Not that one. Look at the leaf edge. Look at the color near the base. The child tries again. This is education, not in a classroom, but in a living world that punishes carelessness. Hunting required equal precision, and perhaps even more patience. A good hunter was not simply strong. Strength mattered, of course, but strength without observation is noise. A hunter had to read tracks in dust and in mud. A hunter had to notice where grass bent unnaturally, where droppings had dried, where a hoof cut deeply and where it barely touched. A hunter had to think in time, not only where the animal was, but where it would be tomorrow, and why. This demanded a mind trained in inference. Weather, water, season, herd movement, fear responses, all folded into one judgment. Picture a group moving through thin morning mist. No one speaks loudly. A hand lifts, then lowers. The others change direction by instinct. They have done this together many times. One person scans a rise. Another studies the ground. Another listens. Far off, birds lift suddenly and settle again. A line of movement appears between grasses. The hunters do not rush. They spread. One circles. Another waits. What matters is not speed alone, but timing, communication, and trust. This is cooperative intelligence, older than writing, older than cities, older than any school. And when a large animal was killed, the whole band benefited. You cannot store endless meat in a warm climate without skill. You cannot eat a large kill alone before it spoils. So sharing was not a noble extra. It was the logic of survival. Food moved through the group. Knowledge moved through the group. Care moved through the group. If one person succeeded, many lived better. This is why archaeologists and anthropologists often describe hunter-gatherer bands as deeply egalitarian. Not because everyone was identical. People differed in skill, age, charm, temper, and influence. But wealth was difficult to accumulate when you were mobile. Authority was fluid. The best tracker might lead the hunt. The elder with memory of droughts might guide movement. The healer with plant knowledge might direct treatment. Then the moment passed, and leadership shifted again. Nobody sat above the rest as a permanent ruler. There was little room for that kind of structure when cooperation mattered more than display. A band of 20 to 50 people could not easily hide conflict. Everyone knew everyone. A selfish act would be remembered. A generous one would be remembered too. Children grew up inside that constant visibility, not raised by two exhausted parents alone, but by many hands. A baby moved from one lap to another. An older sibling watched for danger. An uncle taught knot work. A grandmother corrected a song. This is called alloparenting by anthropologists, but the word can sound colder than the thing itself. Really, it means this. Children belonged to a human circle, not only to a private unit. If you stand in the middle of such a camp in your imagination, you notice how little privacy there is and how much presence. You hear someone splitting bone with a stone blow. You hear someone humming while mending a hide. You hear children argue over something small, then forget it. You smell fat warming near a fire. You smell smoke in hair and skin. You hear elders discussing when to move camp, speaking slowly because the decision matters. A modern person might call it noisy. An ancient nervous system might call it safety. Health is another place where myth clouds everything. People say everyone died at 30. That is not quite true. Life expectancy numbers get dragged down by high childhood mortality, and infant death was indeed a harsh reality in many ancient populations. But if a person survived the vulnerable early years and reached adulthood, they could live far longer than the stereotype suggests. Some likely saw their 60s, some perhaps their 70s. Old age existed. It was not common everywhere, but it was real. Skeletal evidence suggests many hunter-gatherers were in some ways healthier than the first farmers who came after them. They often had fewer cavities, less evidence of certain bone diseases, better signs of broad nutritional variety. They were often taller too. Average human height actually dropped in many regions when agriculture took over, then did not fully recover for a very long time. The body records these shifts without caring about our romantic stories of progress. Part of the reason was diet. Foragers ate from a wider menu: meat, roots, nuts, berries, fish, shellfish, seeds, tubers, seasonal fruits, whatever the region provided. Farmers later narrowed their lives around a few staple crops. Staples can feed many mouths, but they do not always nourish each body well. That shift would come later. For now, in our walk through deep time, variety still ruled. Disease behaved differently too. Epidemic disease likes density. It likes permanent settlements and close contact and accumulated waste. Small mobile bands do not offer the same opportunity. A sickness can move through a group and still burn out because there are not enough bodies close enough together to keep feeding it. This does not mean life was free of pain. Injury was serious. A broken leg in the wrong season could still be catastrophic. A deep wound could still turn. But the disease world of foragers was not the same disease world that cities later created. I have always found it revealing that the more closely we look, the less primitive these people appear. They emerge instead as astonishing specialists. A gatherer could identify hundreds of species. A healer could recognize useful barks, roots, resins, leaves, and molds. A tracker could reconstruct an unseen animal's movements across days. A craftsperson could turn raw stone into a tool sharp enough to cut hide, tendon, and meat with frightening efficiency. A navigator could carry in memory the position of springs, camps, dangerous valleys, and seasonal food grounds across enormous distances. This is expertise. It is simply stored in bodies and stories rather than textbooks. Medicine alone should humble us. Many foraging societies knew what willow bark could do long before chemists named aspirin. They knew that certain plants eased pain. Others helped infection. Others induced vomiting, or calmed cramps, or assisted childbirth, or ended pregnancy. That knowledge did not appear from nowhere. It was gathered by long observation, experiment, mistake, memory, and transmission. Somebody tried. Somebody suffered. Somebody noticed. Somebody remembered. Then the information became tradition. Not superstition, but trial and refinement under conditions where error mattered. You can imagine a healer at dusk beside a low fire. Small bundles of dried leaves. A root sliced open with a flint blade. a flat stone stained by repeated grinding, a bowl with a bitter smell, a child with fever breathing too quickly. The healer crushes, stirs, waits, tastes, and then gives only a small amount. Around them, others watch without interrupting. Trust settles into the space the way smoke settles into cloth. This is not a laboratory, and yet it is experiment shaped into care. So why did this kind of life persist for so long? For not years, not centuries, but hundreds of thousands of years. Because it worked. It was sustainable enough. It was flexible enough. When rains shifted, people shifted. When a region grew poor, bands moved. When one resource failed, another could matter more. This mobility is one of the great forgotten technologies of human history. Movement as adaptation. Refusal to become trapped. Hunter-gatherers were not passive within their environments either. They burned grasslands deliberately in some places. They harvested selectively. They shaped forests and plains in subtle ways. Some regions even show hints of proto-agriculture, careful encouragement of useful species without full farming. The old line between pure foraging and agriculture is blurrier than school books like to admit. Human beings have always experimented. They were just experimenting without plows and fields at first. Still, there were constraints. Band size could not grow endlessly. Dense populations strained sharing. Innovation might remain local if networks were weak. Material accumulation was limited by movement. A successful adaptation can still have ceilings. That does not make it worse. It makes it specific. And understanding that specificity helps explain why our minds and bodies today can feel strangely out of place. We were shaped in small groups, in open landscapes, with direct feedback from weather, hunger, cooperation, and movement. Modern life often asks that ancient wiring to live behind walls, under noise, amid abstraction. No wonder it sometimes protests. Let the image soften now. A morning band under pale light. A child learning plant names. Hunters moving silently through grass. A shared meal at midday. A healer sorting leaves near embers. A group laughing in the long, empty hours we would call leisure, and they would simply call life. This was not a crude prelude to history. This was the main body of human existence. And when the practical work ended, when hands stopped digging roots, or scraping hides or repairing points, people did something equally human. They made meaning. They made beauty. They marked surfaces. They played music. They left images in darkness where no one would casually stumble upon them. In the next part we will go there, down into the caves, where the walls bloom with running horses and handprints like soft ghosts, and the first artists step out of the dark to meet us. Now let the fire in this room grow a little quieter in your mind, because we are going underground. Not into a neat modern tourist cave with railings and electric bulbs, but into an older darkness, cold and damp, where every step feels borrowed and every sound returns softer than it left. Imagine southwestern France. A hole in the ground. A dog slipping through by accident. As one famous story tells it, a teenager following, squeezing through a narrow opening with a weak light in hand, At first, the tunnel is close and rough. Stone brushes shoulders. Air smells of wet mineral, old earth, and stillness. Then the passage opens, and the walls begin to move. Not literally, but that is how it would feel. Horses run across curved rock. Bulls lower their heads as if preparing to charge. Deer stretch in impossible grace. The animals seem to emerge from the wall and then sink back into it as flame flickers. Welcome to Lascaux, one of the most astonishing galleries on Earth, and it is 17,000 years old. Then let that number widen. Lascaux is not the oldest. Not close. Chauvet Cave in southern France contains paintings roughly 36,000 years old. In Indonesia, some hand stencils reach nearly 40,000 years back. When the Great Pyramid was new, these paintings would already have been ancient beyond easy imagination. The distance between Chauvet and ancient Egypt is greater than the distance between ancient Egypt and us. That is the scale we are standing inside. What stops the breath is not only the age, it is the quality. These are not clumsy marks from minds just beginning to wake. These are works of skill. The horses at Lascaux show shading and contour. Artists used the natural bulges of stone to make shoulders swell and flanks turn. At Chauvet, lions and rhinoceros and bears are layered in ways that create motion and depth. Some figures overlap as if one passes behind another. Some are smudged and blended to create shadow. This is technique. Practiced. Intentional. Learned. Picture an artist kneeling beside a wall. A lamp of animal fat burns low. Its light is dimmer than almost anything we use now. The wall has been touched, cleaned, studied. Pigment sits in small containers, ground from charcoal, manganese, iron-rich minerals. The hand reaches up and pauses. The artist has already imagined the animal before the first line is made. A bulge in the stone becomes a shoulder. A crack becomes a leg. The rock is not an obstacle. It is a collaborator. Some of these paintings lie deep in caves, far from daily camp life. To reach them meant squeezing through dangerous passages, carrying materials, returning again and again. This was not idle doodling. It was labor. Scaffolding had to be built in some places to reach high ceilings. Pigments had to be prepared to the right texture. Lamps had to be maintained in air that could swallow flame. All of this suggests importance. The old question then arrives and refuses to leave. Why? The standard answer has often been hunting magic. Paint the animal to influence the hunt. Capture its image and somehow gain power over the living beast. It is elegant, and it may hold some truth in some cases, but it does not solve everything. At Chauvet, many painted animals were not the main food animals. Predators dominate in some chambers. Lions, cave bears, rhinoceros. Dangerous beings, important beings, but not ordinary dinner. So the simple version of hunting magic begins to wobble. Some scholars think the caves were sacred spaces, places for ritual, initiation, trance, and transformation. The deepest chambers, hard to reach, may have mattered precisely because they were hard to reach. Imagine a teenager making the journey for the first time, crawling through narrow stone, breathing air that smells older than language, following elders who say little, then emerging into a chamber where the walls are alive with animals larger than the body, lit by trembling flame. You would not forget it. It would mark you. It would teach you that you belonged to something wider than your own hunger. Others think the paintings may have been stories. Not stories in written lines, but sequences. Chambers as chapters, animals as characters, signs, warnings, memories of migration, teaching devices, maps of relationship between species, seasons, and places. Some walls feel arranged rather than random. There is spacing, clustering, rhythm. It is possible the cave was a library, but one we no longer know how to read. And there is another possibility I find very human. Maybe they made art because they needed to make art, because the wall called for it, because seeing is not always enough, because beauty demands answer. An artist 40,000 years ago may have looked at the shape of a cave wall and seen a horse trapped inside the stone, waiting to be released by line and shadow. That impulse is not primitive. It is familiar. It is still with us whenever someone sees a blank surface and cannot leave it blank. Stand close to one of those animals in your mind. The line is sure. The body is alive. You feel the presence of the hand that made it. Not humanity in general. One person. A particular body in a particular hour. Someone with a sore shoulder, perhaps. Someone tired. Someone irritated when the pigment did not hold. Someone delighted when a shadow suddenly made the animal breathe. That person is gone, yet the gesture remains. And in that remaining gesture there is a form of intimacy that history books rarely offer. Sometimes they left an even more direct trace. A hand pressed against stone, pigment blown around it. Then the hand removed. What remains is a negative handprint, a silhouette of presence, a quiet declaration. I was here. Across caves in France, Indonesia, Argentina, and elsewhere, these hand stencils appear again and again. Large hands, small hands, some likely women, some adolescents, some perhaps children. In one cave, an adult hand and a child's hand appear side by side. It is difficult not to feel something then. A parent and child, perhaps. A teaching moment. Or simply a shared desire not to vanish entirely. If you place your own hand against such a print, the alignment can be unnerving. Finger to finger. Palm to palm. 30,000 years collapse into a single touch that is not really a touch. The human wish behind it is simple and enormous. Remember me. Not by name, perhaps. Not as an individual biography, but as proof that a mind was present here, awake, seeing, choosing, leaving a sign. Not all of art stayed on walls. Portable art flourished too. Tiny figurines carved from ivory or stone. Decorated tools. Pendant from shell, bone, and teeth. Needles marked with careful lines. Objects polished by handling. One famous example, the Venus of Hohlfels, carved from mammoth ivory around 35,000 years ago, fits in the hand and yet radiates intention. It emphasizes the body in particular ways. Perhaps fertility, perhaps abundance, perhaps femininity, perhaps a specific person. We argue because we do not know. What matters first is that someone spent long, careful hours making it. Then someone valued it enough to keep. I like to imagine the touch of that object. Warm ivory, becoming smoother each time it is held. Thumb rubbing the same place. A cord looped through a hole. The figurine carried from camp to camp, hidden in a pouch, taken out at night and turned in the firelight. Preciousness existed long before money. Music existed too. Bone flutes appear around 40,000 years ago. Not crude whistles, but instruments with carefully placed holes that produce a scale. There is even debate about an older possible flute from Divya Babe, perhaps 50,000 years old, though scholars dispute whether its holes were made by human hands. The later flutes are not disputed. They were crafted deliberately. A hollow bird bone, precise spacing, a tool cut and drilled with patience. Someone lifted it to the mouth and made notes no recording will ever recover. Pause and imagine that sound. A cave chamber, a fire, children close to sleep, a flute, line thin and clear in the dark. Perhaps a lullaby, perhaps a ritual melody, perhaps a call used in hunting or mourning. The song itself is gone. The instrument remains, a quiet witness that humans did not only survive, they sang, and likely they danced. Some images seem to suggest movement, bodies not merely standing, but becoming rhythm. Sites with good acoustics and open surfaces may have served performance as much as habitation. Music, dance, firelight, painted animals, trance, teaching, story. All of it may have braided together in ways we can barely reconstruct. In those moments, art was not separated from life. It was part of the same human task, making reality meaningful enough to inhabit. There is a haunting question beneath all of this. Was there art long before the art we can still see? Probably. Paint on bark would vanish. Color on skin would vanish. Images on leather would vanish. Wood carvings would rot. We have ochre pieces with abstract engravings from South Africa around 75,000 years ago, and pigment use even earlier than that. Those marks are not full horses on cave walls. Still, they suggest that representational cave art may not have been a sudden miracle. It may have been only the point where art began surviving in durable materials. This idea changes the emotional shape of the story. Instead of imagining one sudden explosion of creativity, we can imagine a much longer tradition of making and marking, mostly lost. 100,000 years of painted bodies, scratched signs, decorated tools, songs, masks, temporary forms that time devoured. What we call the first art may simply be the first art that time failed to erase. The first scientists to see some of these cave paintings refused to believe they were genuinely ancient. The quality offended their assumptions. Nothing that old could be that good, they thought. That refusal tells us as much about modern arrogance as it does about prehistory. We still struggle to believe that intelligence and aesthetic power did not begin with civilization. Yet the walls insist. The walls say otherwise. The walls say, "We were here before your cities, before your kings, before your books, and we knew how to make beauty from darkness." Sit with that for a moment. A person deep underground. A lamp guttering. A line of charcoal drawn across stone. Then another. A shoulder emerges. A neck curves. A horn extends. The animal steps into being. At that instant, the cave holds three realities at once: stone, image, and imagination. That crossing may be one of the oldest truly human acts we can still witness. And it is not only beauty. It is communication across time. Every artist leaves an offering to strangers. The future is one of those strangers. The painters of Chauvet did not know us, yet their animals still move our pulse. Their hands still instruct ours in what it means to care about form. Their courage in entering darkness still reaches us. That is one of the most beautiful and eerie things about prehistory. It is silent, and it is still speaking. As the lamplight moves over the wall, the animals seem to flicker into motion. A horse turns. A bull lowers its head. A lion seems to watch. It is easy to understand how art, ritual, and altered consciousness might meet in such a place. If a person spent hours in the dark, breathing smoke, listening to echoes, fasting, drumming, or simply becoming absorbed, the cave itself could become a threshold. And perhaps that was the point. Not decoration for a home, but entry into another layer of reality. This is where art stops being a luxury and becomes necessity. To make contact, to teach, to remember, to transform fear into form, to leave the human self outside for a while and enter a world of animals, shadow, and meaning. The paintings may have served many purposes at once. Ritual, instruction, identity, pleasure, memory. We do not have to reduce them to one. When you listen to stories before sleep, something similar happens in a softer way. The room stays the same, and yet it becomes larger. The fire crackles, and yet you are also in a cave, in a corridor, in the presence of someone long dead and somehow still present. That is the old magic of art. It carries a mind across distance without requiring a road. The people who made those paintings were not waiting for civilization. They were already artists, already dreamers, already fully themselves. And when they stepped back from the wall and looked at the finished animal by flickering light, I wonder if they felt what artists still feel now. That soft release, that quiet recognition. Yes, there you are. Now others can see what I saw. In the next part, we will step out of the cave and into a colder world. The long testing ground of ice and wind and hunger, where humans learned to sew, to build from bone, to survive climate swings that would terrify modern societies, and where small bands of people kept the flame of our species alive under impossible skies. The world outside the cave was not gentle. It was beautiful. Yes, in the way that a frozen river under stars can be beautiful. But beauty and deep time rarely meant comfort. For long stretches of human existence, the planet moved through cold phases so severe that whole regions became nearly unrecognizable. Ice advanced. Forests retreated. Wind sharpened. Water vanished from one place and gathered in another. And somehow, impossibly, humans not only endured these shifts, they learned to live inside them with a kind of practical brilliance that still feels almost unbelievable. Picture the Earth around 20,000 years ago. Ice sheets, miles thick, covered huge parts of the North. What would one day be Canada lay under crushing white weight? So did much of Scandinavia. Cold reached south with a patient cruelty. Changing weather, changing migrations, changing rivers, changing every small rhythm that people depended on. The planet was not one endless winter, not one frozen still life. It swung. Cold deepened, then relaxed, then deepened again. Generations were born into one climate and grew old in another. No one could assume the world would stay as it was. If you were standing there with me on an Ice Age plain, the first thing you would notice would be the air. It would bite the inside of the nose. Breathing deeply would sting. The wind would carry tiny grains of ice and old dust and the scent of animals somewhere beyond the visible line of the land. The ground underfoot might be iron hard in the morning, then soften slightly at the top layer by afternoon, only to seize again when the light faded. And yet there would still be movement. Smoke from a camp. Tracks. A line of people bent into the wind. A child wrapped so carefully against cold that only the eyes were visible. This is where one of the oldest myths about ancient humans begins to collapse. They did not simply survive by cowering near flames and hoping for luck. They engineered survival. They solved winter with tools, planning, memory, and cooperation. They invented systems. And once you start noticing those systems, the Ice Age stops looking like a long punishment and starts looking like a proving ground for human ingenuity. Clothing is the obvious place to begin. Not a loose hide thrown over shoulders. Not a cartoon pelt tied badly at the waist. Real clothing. Tailored clothing. Layered clothing. Clothing built to trap heat, block wind, and let a body move across frozen ground without turning numb. We know this because bone needles appear in archaeological sites from Ice Age, Europe, and Asia. Fine, precise, specialized tools. Some are so slender they still look delicate now, even after tens of thousands of years. A needle means more than sewing. It means pattern making. It means someone understood that a body is not a simple shape. A shoulder curves. A knee bends. A wrist needs movement. A seam placed badly lets in wind. A seam placed well saves fingers from frost, saves a child from fever, saves an elder one more winter. Imagine a hide stretched out flat. A scraper moves across it in repeated strokes, removing fat and tissue. The smell is strong, animal, and cold and raw. Hands ache from work. The hide is smoked, softened, worked again. Then cut carefully, not randomly. A shape imagined before it exists. A sleeve. A wrap for the legs. A hood that follows the skull close enough to keep warmth, but loose enough to turn the head. Sinew thread is twisted and fed through a bone needle. The stitch holes run in lines, small and tight. The maker pauses, feels the edge, tests the seam by pulling. No gap. Good. Continue. Some archaeologists think these people were building layered clothing systems, much like modern cold weather gear. A base layer close to the skin. An insulating layer of fur. An outer shell more resistant to wet and wind. We cannot reconstruct every garment. Leather rots. Fiber vanishes. Still, the needles, the hide-working tools, and the sheer fact of human survival in those regions make one thing clear. These were not improvised wraps. These were designs. Shelter tells the same story. In forested zones, wood could be used, but in the treeless cold steppes of Ice Age Europe and Asia, wood was often scarce. So people improvised with what they had. And what they had, in some places, was mammoth bone. It still sounds unreal when you say it slowly. Houses made from the bones of mammoths. But the archaeological record gives us circles of skulls and long bones arranged in patterns too deliberate to be anything else. Frameworks of immense remains. Dome-like structures. Foundations of tusk and jaw and rib. Covered, most likely, with hides, turf, brush, or whatever insulating materials could be secured. Not temporary windbreaks. In some cases, true dwellings. Picture one in winter. Outside, the land is pale and hard. Wind runs across open ground with nothing to stop it. Inside, the shelter holds a different climate. The walls curve inward. Hide coverings soften the edges of bone. A fire burns in a prepared hearth. Smoke rises slowly and finds its escape through a planned opening. The air smells of heated marrow, hide, ash, old wool, human breath. A child sits near the warmest spot and traces lines in packed earth. An elder adjusts a seam in a fur garment. Someone turns a bone in the fire. Someone else sharpens a point by lamplight. The house creaks slightly when the wind strikes, but it holds. At one site in present-day Ukraine, mammoth bone structures seem to require the remains of dozens of mammoths. The exact use of every site is debated. Some may have been houses, some task areas, some seasonal occupation points. Still, the scale alone reveals organized labor and planning. To gather that much material, transport it, arrange it, stabilize it, and live within it requires more than brute force. It requires design and memory. It requires a community able to cooperate across time, not just in the urgency of a hunt, but in construction that lasts. Fire management becomes another hidden technology here. A fire is not just a flame. In severe cold, it is architecture. It is medicine. It is social gravity. It is a machine for turning fuel into survivable air. When wood was scarce, people burned bone, especially fat-rich bone, which can produce intense heat but behaves differently from timber. To use it well, you must understand ignition, airflow, Placement. A careless fire smokes the shelter and chokes the people inside. A well-managed one warms, dries, cooks, protects, and lasts. You can imagine someone kneeling near a hearth lined with stone. One hand adjusts a burning piece with another bone. A small burst of sparks. The smell sharp and mineral. The person waits, watching how the heat catches, whether the smoke thickens, whether the flame needs more air or less. This is engineering in the language of embers. No equations written down. Still, equations solved. And outside those shelters moved the great Ice Age animals. Mammoths, woolly rhinoceros, huge bison, reindeer, animals as large as problems, animals that could feed a band for a long time, and also kill with terrifying ease if approached without skill. So the hunt became another place where human intelligence sharpened. How do you kill a mammoth with stone-tipped spears? Not by charging foolishly. Not alone. Very likely through group tactics refined across many seasons. Watching migration routes. Knowing where herds narrow between natural barriers. Knowing which valley channels movement. Knowing when ice on a river can become a trap rather than a risk. Some sites suggest repeated use of specific kill zones. That means memory and return. A landscape not merely crossed, but studied. Picture a planning scene before the hunt. The wind is low tonight. The hunters sit in a half circle, shoulders wrapped, faces turned toward a small fire. One draws a rough map in the dust with a stick. A ridge, a depression, a likely path. Another interrupts and changes one line. Not there. The ice broke there last season. A third points with 2 fingers and taps twice, meaning the flankers will move wide. A younger hunter watches and says nothing. The lesson is entering through the eyes first. At dawn, when boots crunch and breath lifts, the plan will already live in the body. A successful hunt was followed by a second achievement that modern people underestimate. Processing. A large animal is not wealth until its wealth is turned into usable forms. Meat stripped. Fat rendered. Hide cut and preserved. Bones sorted. Sinew removed and dried. Teeth, tusk, horn, marrow. Every element examined for possible use. A mammoth was food. Shelter, cordage, needles, wedges, isplaying, containers, ornament, memory. Waste was a luxury the Ice Age rarely allowed. Natural refrigeration helped too. Frozen ground and prolonged cold meant that, in some circumstances, meat could be stored longer than in warmer climates. That changed planning. A successful kill might support not only tonight and tomorrow, but much more. So a hunt was not merely a moment of violence. It was a logistical event, an exercise in labor coordination, preservation, sharing, transport, and future thinking. Still, even the most skilled people could not control climate. And climate in this era could turn harshly with little warning. One generation might know a workable route through a region, and the next might find it buried under ice, dried to dust, or emptied of the animals they depended on. This is where the story becomes darker. Human populations crashed more than once. Genetic evidence suggests bottlenecks, moments when total numbers dropped alarmingly low. Not necessarily to a few dozen, not always dramatic in the same way, but low enough that the species balanced near an edge. What saved us, again and again, may have been our pattern of living. Small groups spread across large ranges, connected enough that ideas and mates and aid could move, separate enough that one local disaster did not erase everyone. A disease in one band did not immediately become a global event. A famine in one valley did not starve a whole continent. People moved. Movement was protection. Variation was protection. Distance was protection. And then the Ice Age offered something strange. Opportunity. When sea levels dropped because so much water was locked in ice, land appeared where there is water now. Not little scraps of mud. Whole bridges between continents. Beringia between Asia and North America. Sunda linking mainland Southeast Asia to what are now islands. Other shelves and routes that turned the map into something much wider and more connected. These were not merely crossings. They were landscapes in their own right. Grasslands, coastal corridors, places with resources, places where humans and prey could travel for generations without anyone saying, "Now we are crossing into another continent." The map we know did not yet exist. The world was open in different ways, and people took those openings. Coasts mattered too. Exposed shorelines gave access to shellfish, fish, birds, eggs, marine mammals, reliable food, easy trails along the edge between land and sea. If a group learned how to move along coastlines, they could carry familiar strategies into unfamiliar regions. This may help explain how humans reached Australia at least 50,000 years ago. Even with lowered sea levels, some stretches required open water crossings. Not accidents. Not driftwood miracles. Repeated, deliberate attempts. Imagine standing at an ancient shore before one of those crossings. The sea is dark and hard-edged. Wind presses against skin. A boat sits half in the surf, made of wood and fiber and knowledge that left almost no archaeological trace. Hands hold it steady while others load what matters most. Tools, water, children, fire, memory. Someone studies the stars after sunset. Someone watches birds at dawn. Someone knows from swell patterns and current lines that land exists beyond sight. To step into that boat is not only courage, it is trust in accumulated knowledge. This is one of the great hidden achievements of prehistoric humans. Not simply endurance. Confidence in learned patterns. Enough confidence to leave one visible shore for another invisible one. Once you understand that, the phrase primitive becomes impossible to say without embarrassment. As the Ice Age went on, people adapted to more and more environments. Steppe, forest edge, mountain margins, southern refuges where climate stayed milder and human populations sometimes grew denser. In places like the Franco-Cantabrian zone of southwestern Europe, Relatively favorable conditions may have helped support the cultural richness that gave us caves like Lascaux and Chauvet. Cold does not erase art. Sometimes it concentrates people and traditions in places where expression becomes intense. Africa tells a parallel story. Rainfall shifted. Lakes expanded and vanished. The Sahara itself changed repeatedly, sometimes greener, sometimes brutally dry. Human groups followed those changes, moved, adapted, returned, split, met again. Asia diversified into altitude, forest, steppe, coast, and river systems. Wherever a path opened, humans learned it. Wherever a climate closed in, humans tested its edges. By the time the last great cold loosened its grip around 12,000 years ago, humans had passed every test the Ice Age could invent. Not because they were invincible, because they were flexible, because they remembered, because they taught, because they kept the fire lit long enough for the next person to learn what the last one knew. Let the wind soften now in your mind. The mammoth bone house glows from within. The tailored seam holds. The hearth breathes steadily. A group of people sit close, not defeated by the cold outside, but shaped by it, sharpened by it, made more inventive by the need to answer it. And beyond their shelter, beyond the reach of the fire, roots are opening across continents and shorelines. In the next part, we will follow those roots. We will step out of Africa and into the long migration that put human footprints on nearly every habitable place on Earth. We will move with the coast, with the stars, with luck, with language, and with whatever it was that made our species impossible to stop. The first step out of Africa may have been almost invisible. A single footprint in wet coastal mud, a heel pressed down, toes spread slightly in soft sand. Then the tide returning, smoothing edges, lifting grains, carrying away the exact shape of a life-changing moment. What matters is not that the print survived. It almost certainly did not. What matters is that the step happened. By around 60,000 years ago, perhaps a little earlier in some waves, perhaps later in others, depending on the region and the evidence, groups of Homo sapiens began leaving Africa in ways that would not end in failure. There had been earlier human dispersals by other species. Homo erectus had spread far into Asia long before. Other archaic humans had reached and occupied lands beyond Africa and then disappeared or contracted when climate changed. But this movement was different. This time the migrants carried the full package of our species. The brains, the bodies, the social flexibility, the storytelling, the technical memory, the cooperative intelligence that had been accumulating through hundreds of thousands of years of living in unstable environments. They probably did not think, we are going to populate the world. They were likely following game, or seeking water, or responding to conflict, or simply doing what humans do best, moving one camp farther, then another, and then another, until the old homeland was behind them and a new coast was ahead. That is one of the strange truths of history. World-changing movements often begin as local decisions. Picture a family band moving along a coastline, not marching in a line like a map animation. Moving in starts and pauses. A child lags to inspect shells. An elder pauses to rest and judge the tide. Someone points toward birds circling over a fish-rich patch. Someone else studies the shoreline for fresh water or a place sheltered enough for a camp. The sea gives rhythm, waves, wind, gulls, foam on rock. The coast becomes a guide because coasts are generous to people who know how to read them. Shellfish, fish, bird eggs, seaweed, driftwood, animal tracks at estuary mouths. A beach in Arabia is not the same as a beach in India, but the logic of the edge between land and sea travels well. These migrants may have moved faster than we intuitively imagine. Not fast in one lifetime. No one sprinted across continents. But a few kilometers in one generation becomes an astonishing distance across many. 5 or 10 kilometers of shift per generation, compounded over 1,000 generations, is enough to redraw the world. The migration feels slow to the walker and breathtaking to the archaeologist. And then there is Australia. This is the point where the story stops feeling merely impressive and begins to feel almost unbelievable. Humans reached Australia at least 50,000 years ago, perhaps earlier by some estimates. Even with lower sea levels, that journey required open water crossings, not an accidental drift on debris, not a person blown out to sea and luckily arriving with a family. Repeated, deliberate movement across stretches of water where land could not always be seen from shore. Imagine the preparations. A shoreline camp watching the sea for days. Wood selected. Fiber twisted and retwisted. A vessel shaped through methods we may not fully recover because wood, rope, and skin rot away. A child asking whether the land on the other side is real. An elder saying yes, because the birds turn that way at dawn and return differently at dusk. A navigator watching swells. A woman checking bundles of food and water. A coal protected in ash so fire can survive the crossing. Then the launch. Cold water climbing over ankles. A push. The vessel lifting and dropping. Hands paddling in rhythm. The horizon empty and still full of promise. Some voyages must have failed. Storms do not spare ambition. Currents do not respect intelligence. Still, enough succeeded. And once people arrived, they did not cling weakly to the shore. They adapted. They spread across varied Australian environments, rainforests, dry interior lands, coasts, woodlands. Over immense spans of time, Aboriginal Australians developed some of the most sophisticated ecological knowledge systems on Earth, including refined fire management that reshaped landscapes with astonishing skill. That alone tells you something essential. These migrants were not fragile. They were innovators. Other branches of the Out of Africa movement turned north and west and east. In the Middle East and farther into Eurasia, they encountered other humans, Neanderthals first among them. The genetic legacy is clear. Modern populations in Europe and much of Asia carry Neanderthal ancestry. That means meeting, mating, mixing. Not once, but enough times to leave permanent marks in living bodies. The old idea that one species simply replaced another without contact is gone. The reality is more intimate and more complicated. Then farther east came Denisovan encounters, We know less about them in body because their fossils are so sparse. A tooth, fragments, trace, still. Their DNA persists strongly in some modern populations, especially in Melanesia and nearby regions. Some genetic variants derived from Denisovans help Tibetans process oxygen at high altitude. Think about how astonishing that is. A meeting tens of thousands of years ago still changes how lungs work on mountain slopes today. Deep time is not dead. It breathes inside physiology. Europe was another great threshold. Modern humans reached it roughly 45 to 40,000 years ago, depending on the site and the date. Neanderthals had already been there for immense spans of time. They knew the winters. They knew the valleys. They knew the prey. For a while, both kinds of humans shared the continent. Then, within a few thousand years, Neanderthals as a separate population disappeared. Not necessarily because of endless open warfare, though conflict surely happened at times. More likely from a blend of competition, demographic pressure, environmental stress, interbreeding, and the quiet mathematics of larger, more connected populations gradually absorbing or outcompeting smaller ones. There is something mournful about that. For most of Earth history, multiple human species existed at once. Then one remained. The age of human diversity narrowed. We are the last branch, still speaking in our own name. But traces of those others still move through our blood, and I think that matters. It makes the human story feel less like conquest and more like inheritance. Complicated, partial, haunted. Now let us travel farther north into regions where winter could become almost unbearable. Siberia, Arctic margins, places where temperatures could fall so low that air itself seemed brittle. And yet humans reached them by 30,000 years ago, perhaps earlier in some areas. They did not merely pass through. They lived there. They tailored clothing, built semi-subterranean shelters, used mammoth ivory and bone for tools and ornaments, buried their dead with grave goods, made beauty in places where the world seemed determined to strip life down to necessity. This is one of the most moving parts of the story for me. The farther conditions pushed towards severity, the more visibly humans carried meaning with them. Then comes the Americas, the great debated crossing. For a long time, the simplest model said humans entered around 13,000 years ago through an ice-free corridor from Beringia into North America. But archaeology has complicated that picture. Sites in both North and South America keep pushing dates earlier. 15,000, maybe more. Some controversial sites hint at even older occupations. The route itself may also have varied. Some groups likely moved along the Pacific coast by boat and shoreline hopping, rather than only through interior corridors. It is debated. It is active. The map keeps changing as evidence grows. What feels certain is speed once entry was established. Humans appear to have moved through the Americas astonishingly quickly. Within only a few thousand years, they were deep into South America, adapting to tundra, plains, forests, mountains, coastlines, and tropical systems. That rate of spread is almost dizzying. It speaks to flexibility, to knowledge sharing, to the human appetite for edge and distance. A continent is not one challenge. It is many challenges at once. Still, they kept moving. Picture a migration southward through the Americas. A band on a cold coast. Then another band weeks later at a river mouth. Then mountain people learning thin air and steep ground. Then lowland foragers in a forest where humidity wraps the skin and every leaf hides either food or danger. A child born on the move grows into an adult who no longer remembers the earlier landscape at all. To them, this new place is the center. Migration becomes home by repetition. And yet we should be careful not to make movement sound like pure adventure. It also meant loss. The coast left behind. The dead buried where you may never return. The language of one valley stretched to fit another. The uncertainty of every camp. The possibility that the next river is impassable. The next shoreline barren. The next winter too sharp. Migration is courage, yes, but it is also exhaustion and trust and grief carried quietly. Later still, though beyond the deepest Paleolithic frame, human voyaging would reach another extraordinary expression in Polynesia. Double-hulled canoes, star paths, wave reading, bird behavior. Thousands of kilometers of ocean crossed deliberately to reach islands no one could see from shore, although this happens much later than the first out of Africa expansions. It belongs to the same long human pattern. We learn environments by attention, then move through them with confidence born from memory. Ocean becomes another kind of road. DNA has turned all of this into an even stranger story. Modern genetics lets us trace divergence, mixing, return migration, lost branches. The human family tree looks less like a tree now and more like braided channels of water. Populations split, rejoin, leave traces, disappear in bone, and survive in genes. Some genetic signatures hint at groups we have not yet found in the fossil record at all. Ghost populations. People known only through what they left in others. I find there is something deeply soothing in that complexity. Not because it is simple, but because it is honest. Humanity was never neat. Never one line marching toward destiny. We were scattered, connected, lucky, inventive, wounded, curious, and somehow the scattered parts kept finding one another. The success of Homo sapiens may rest in that ability more than anything else. Not in simple superiority, in flexibility, in social connection that could stretch farther, in language rich enough to transmit more than immediate warning, in memory networks, in the ability to make camp with strangers and then turn those strangers into kin through exchange, story, marriage, trade. A larger network survives shocks better than an isolated group. An idea shared widely survives the death of one elder. A migration route sung into memory survives the loss of a map because the map lives in bodies. Imagine night again, because so much of this story belongs to night. A camp on a shoreline. The sea dark and breathing. A child asleep against a rolled hide. An elder pointing upward. Stars named through story. Not abstract astronomy yet, but practical and sacred together. When that cluster rises there, the season changes. When that bright one leans low, currents shift. The stars become memory hooks. Navigation becomes chant. A voyage tomorrow begins in language tonight. This is why I resist the word primitive so strongly. To launch a boat into unseen distance with children aboard requires not only courage, but layers of inherited confidence. To walk a coastline for generations and know when it will still feed you. To move into a continent full of new animals and new weather and not simply vanish. To meet another human species and carry part of them forward in your blood. These are not primitive acts. These are difficult triumphs. By the time humans had spread across Eurasia, Australia, and eventually the Americas, the Earth itself had become a humanly inhabited thing in a new way. Not civilized in the later sense. No cities yet. No empires. But human fires burned in astonishingly many places. Human voices rose in climates once thought unreachable. And across all of it, adaptation kept unfolding. Tailored cold weather clothing in one region. Coastal shell fishing in another. High altitude physiology in another. Local solutions, all part of one species. As you listen now, lying still, while this long movement passes through your mind, you might notice how strange it is that all of this happened with no central plan, no empire directing it, no single invention guaranteeing success. Just one band after another making local decisions, preserving useful knowledge, and passing it on. That is often how the deepest changes in history happen. Not as a proclamation, as accumulation. In the next part, we will slow that motion and turn inward. Because movement across continents is only one side of the old human story. The other side is what people believed as they moved. What they thought death meant. Why they buried with flowers and red ochre. Why the world itself may have felt alive to them. Why caves, stars, plants, and dream states were not separate from practical life, but woven into one living cosmology. For now, let the shoreline dim. Let the boat settle on dark water. Let the stars keep their positions overhead. Human beings are leaving one world behind and making another. Step by step, fire by fire, crossing by crossing. Now, the story turns inward. And in some ways, that is the strangest turn of all. We have followed humans across coasts, grasslands, ice fields, and open water. We have watched them sow against cold, build from bone, and carry fire into impossible climates. But survival alone does not explain us. A species can eat, move, mate, and endure without ever placing flowers beside the dead, without ever grinding red pigment into ritual dust, without ever staring into darkness and asking what waits there. At some point, long before temples, books, or priests, humans began to do something more difficult than survival. They began to make death meaningful. There is a burial in a cave in what is now northern Iraq, a place called Shanidar. For many years it was described in a way that captured the imagination immediately. Neanderthals, our close human relatives, appeared to have buried one of their dead with flowers. Pollen grains were found in unusual concentrations around the body. The image was irresistible. Someone kneeling beside a grave 100,000 years ago, or thereabout in the older telling, arranging blooms around a loved one, trying in the smallest and most human way to soften the edge of loss. The dates and the exact interpretation have been debated. Some scholars argue the pollen may have entered the grave by natural means, perhaps through burrowing animals. Others still think deliberate placement remains possible. We cannot be entirely sure, but even the debate reveals something important. The possibility feels plausible because these early humans were already doing things that step beyond utility. And burial goes much deeper than one debated cluster of pollen. Some of the oldest deliberate human burials known to us come from the Levant, from places like Chauvet and Lascaux, stretching back roughly 100,000 years and more in some discussions of older forms. Bodies placed with care, hands arranged, positions maintained, objects nearby, the dead not left where they fell, not pushed away like refuse, but moved, placed, covered, remembered. To bury deliberately is to pause the ordinary flow of life and say, this person still matters even after breath is gone. That is one of the oldest spiritual sentences we can still read in the ground. Picture such a burial at dusk. The day has already thinned. The air is cool and carries the scent of stone and dry soil. A small group stands near a shallow grave cut into earth that took hours to open with simple tools. Hands are blistered. Fingers are packed with clay. No one is in a hurry now. The work has been done. The body is lowered carefully. One person steadies the shoulders. Another adjusts the legs. A child, kept close but not sent away, watches from behind an elder. A silence settles that is not empty. It is full of attention. Then a handful of red ochre is lifted and let fall. Red ochre appears again and again in ancient graves, not only with Homo sapiens, sometimes with Neanderthals too, depending on the site and the interpretation. This iron-rich pigment, bright as dried blood and sunset clay, mattered desperately to ancient people. It turns up in burials across Africa, Europe, and Asia. It is rubbed onto bodies, sprinkled over bones, packed around the dead in quantities too large to be accidental. What did it mean? No one can answer with certainty. Some think it symbolized blood and life force, a way of giving the dead back the color of living skin. Some think it represented rebirth, the red of dawn, the promise that what descends might rise again in another form. Some think it marked sacred transition, neither strictly practical nor fully doctrinal, but powerful because it linked body, earth, and memory in one visible gesture. Whatever the precise belief, the labor speaks. Ochre had to be found, carried, ground, and applied. That is effort directed toward meaning. Then there are grave goods, tools placed beside bodies, points and blades set near hands that will never use them again, animal bones laid in graves, perhaps food for a journey, perhaps gifts, perhaps signs of identity, shell beads, bandans, pieces of ornament carried into darkness. If you bury someone with beautiful or useful things, you are already imagining an elsewhere, not necessarily a paradise, not necessarily a sharply defined afterlife, but some extension, some continuation, some reason the dead might still need company, or symbols, or provisions. This is where prehistory begins to feel almost painfully familiar. Our ancestors did not know what lay after death. That uncertainty did not stop them from acting with tenderness. And beneath those burials lies a worldview stranger than most modern people can comfortably inhabit. A world in which nothing was fully dead matter. A world in which rivers, stones, storms, animals, and places were not just resources or scenery. They were beings. Not metaphorically, not in a literary sense, actually alive with awareness and force. Anthropologists call this animism, but the word can sound technical and thin compared with the experience itself. For ancient humans, the world may have felt crowded with presences. The rock that made the best tools was not only useful, it was a partner, perhaps a gift giver, perhaps a difficult being that yielded itself only to the right hands. The deer that stepped into a clearing was not merely meat. It was another kind of person, living according to another language, deserving respect before and after the kill. The river was not only moving water, it remembered. It fed. It drowned. It answered conduct with consequence. If you live this way, in direct dependence on wind, game, season, and spring water, the line between practical observation and spiritual meaning becomes very thin. You notice patterns because your life depends on them. Birds change behavior before weather shifts. Certain plants appear where particular animals browse. Water flows differently after distant storms you never saw. A ridge feels exposed. A grove feels safe. A cave mouth feels open in a way that ordinary space does not. The world speaks, and over generations the speaking becomes tradition. Stories gather around places. Rules gather around animals. Respect gathers around the materials that sustain life. Animism, in that sense, is not childish confusion. It is a rigorous relationship to a living environment, one in which cause and meaning are never fully separate. And if the world is alive in this way, then some humans will always become specialists in listening. Here we come to shamans. Though the word itself belongs to later Siberian traditions and is used broadly by anthropologists with caution, still, the pattern is widespread enough to matter. Some people seem to have served as mediators, crossing between ordinary awareness and altered states, seeking knowledge, healing, guidance, weather, game, and explanation from forces beyond the normal waking mind. The evidence for such practices appears in fragments, hybrid figures painted on cave walls, bodies that are human and animal at once, beings with antlers, bird heads, feline faces, or masks that blur categories. These are sometimes called therianthropes. They may represent mythic beings, spirit journeys, trance states, ritual clothing, or some combination of all of these. We do not know, but they suggest a serious effort to imagine consciousness moving across forms. How would such people enter altered states? There are many possibilities, and later, hunter-gatherer traditions provide hints. Rhythmic drumming for hours. Dancing until exhaustion strips the body of its ordinary sense of boundary. Fasting. Isolation in darkness. Exposure to cold or heat. Breath control. pain, monotony, sleep deprivation, and very likely plant medicines in some environments, although direct evidence is often frustratingly hard to pin down for deep prehistory. Human groups knew their landscapes intimately. They knew which plants healed, which nourished, which poisoned, and which changed perception. Psilocybin mushrooms, datura, henbane, ergot. Many of these belong to later documented traditions, and projecting them backward requires caution. Still, the broader point stands. Ancient humans had both the curiosity and the botanical knowledge to discover consciousness-altering substances. And in many cultures, such substances became technologies of encounter rather than entertainment. Imagine a cave chamber lit by small lamps of animal fat. A group sits in a semicircle. The air is warm near the lamps and cold on the skin farther back. The walls around them hold painted forms: horses, bison, lions, shapes that seem to breathe when flame trembles. A drum begins, not loud, just steady. A low pulse repeated until it stops feeling like an external sound and starts feeling like another layer of heartbeat. One figure moves into the center, antlered perhaps, or masked, or simply shadowed so that the body seems altered. The watching group says very little. The point is not spectacle. The point is crossing, where the vision's real. That question is less useful than modern minds often assume. They were real enough to structure communities, real enough to determine where hunts were made, which rituals mattered, which songs were taught, which stories survived. A trance experience that reveals a hunting route, a medicine, a taboo, or a new song becomes socially real whether or not it fits a later scientific explanation. Our ancestors were not separating practical life from spiritual life in the way industrial societies later try to do. To them, the cosmos may have been one continuous field of relationship, with ordinary waking life only one layer of it. This is why places mattered so much. A cave was not only shelter. A hilltop was not only elevation. A spring was not only water. Some places were thresholds. Some gathered story and fear and reverence over time until people approached them differently, moved more quietly there, left offerings, or avoided them entirely. A landscape under animism becomes morally textured. There are right ways to pass a place, right words to say, right times to take, and right times to leave alone. And then, startlingly late in the old hunter-gatherer story, and yet still long before farming dominates, we arrive at a site that should not exist if our tidy models were correct. Göbekli Tepe, a hilltop in what is now Turkey. Massive T-shaped stone pillars carved with animals and abstract signs, arranged in circular enclosures and dated to about 11,600 years ago. Older than Stonehenge by millennia, older than the pyramids by much more, and the builders, as far as the evidence suggests, were hunter-gatherers or very early transitional communities, not full agricultural city builders with granaries and bureaucracies. That discovery shook archaeology because it reversed an old assumption. For a long time, many scholars imagined religion and monumental architecture as products of settled farming societies with surplus. First, agriculture, then temples. Göbekli Tepe complicates that neat order. Here, gathering and ritual on a monumental scale may have come first, drawing people together and perhaps helping create the social conditions that later pushed toward cultivation. Meaning itself can be a survival force, a reason to organize, a reason to return, a reason to build something greater than any one person's immediate need. And they were watching the sky. Across the prehistoric world, later, stone circles, cave alignments, and horizon markers suggest long observation of the heavens. We must be careful not to exaggerate precision. Still, there is no serious doubt that many ancient peoples watched sun, moon, and stars with extraordinary care. Season matters when survival depends on migration, thaw, ripening, and calving. A sunrise at a certain notch in the horizon is not just beautiful, it is information. And once timing becomes sacred, astronomy and theology merge. The tragedy, if it can be called that, is that we will never fully recover their doctrines, assuming doctrine is even the right word. They left no theological texts, no creed, no preserved explanation of why red mattered, why a pillar faced one direction and not another, why one cave chamber held horses and another lions. All we have are clues, and then the clues end. Still, perhaps that is fitting. The ancient world was full of mystery, even for the people living in it. They did not solve existence, they responded to it. With care, with ritual, with color, with burial, with song, with the humility of being small beneath a very large sky. And perhaps that humility is one of the deepest lessons hidden in the missing years. Our ancestors lived for immense spans without certainty. They had stories, practices, places of power, altered states, sacred materials, graves, and stars. They built meaning not because they had answers, but because they needed ways to live with unanswerable things. Death, dreams, storms, consciousness. The stubborn fact that love and loss exist in a world that otherwise seems indifferent. As you rest with this, the firelight in your room can become another small ritual space. The crackle of wood, the shifting of shadows, the soft rise and fall of breath. No need to force belief in anything. Only notice how old the human need is. To sit with others, to tell stories at the edge of dark, to make the world feel inhabited rather than empty. In the next part, we will turn from spirit to technique again, though the two are never fully separate. We will look at the hidden technologies of deep time, the shaping of stone, the reading of waves, the knowledge of plants, the massive feats of moving earth and rock, the oral libraries carried in memory when nothing could yet be written down. Because before civilization, before archives, humans were already inventors of astonishing quiet brilliance. Now the fire burns lower, and that feels right, because the last part of this journey belongs to quiet intelligence. Not the loud kind that announces itself with towers and metal. The older kind. The kind that lives in fingertips, in remembered roots, in precise strikes made by people sitting under open sky with nothing but stone. bone, breath, and time. If you want to understand the missing 100,000 years before civilization, you have to understand that the greatest technologies of that era often left almost nothing behind. And that may be why modern people underestimate them. Picture someone seated near a campfire on a cold night. They are holding a core of flint in one hand and a hammerstone in the other. At a glance, it looks simple, almost childish, just hitting rocks together. But if you slow the scene down, it becomes extraordinary. The angle of the wrist matters. The hardness of the hammer matters. The platform edge matters. The hidden grain inside the stone matters. One strike too hard and the whole thing shatters badly. One strike too soft and the flake fails. A successful napper is not smashing. They are predicting fracture in 3 dimensions before it happens. A flake lifts away, long and curved, thinner than you expected. Its edge is already sharp enough to cut skin. Another strike removes another flake. Soon the tool begins to emerge. A point, a blade, a scraper, a knife. Standardized, balanced, made not by luck, but by repeated control. Some ancient craftspeople became so skilled that modern experimental archaeologists spend years trying to reproduce their work convincingly. That should tell you something. This was not crude. This was engineering in mineral form. Think about what such skill implies. A long chain of reasoning, knowledge of raw material sources, the ability to choose